First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to the Spotlight series, and I also wanted to extend a very warm welcome to the distinguished panel that we'll be hearing from this evening. And as most of you should know, the topic tonight deals with access to capital, and we'll be looking at international, comparative, and national examples and stories from leaders and advocates and scholars who work in this area. And it's also an appropriate time to say a special thanks and honor the traditional territory that we are on of the Coast Salish people, and it's also very appropriate and fitting and indeed a privilege to have Chief Alan Claxton here tonight with us from the Sayo First Nation, which many of the students now know is just down the road from us. So this is the great thing about the University of Victoria community. We are situated directly in the heart of First Nations and Aboriginal communities, which makes this such a special place. And so tonight's order, it's going to begin with my colleague, Christina Bishop, who is a Director of Operations for Diversity, as it is now termed in the Inter-American Development Bank. She is a member of the Chippewas of Rama First Nations. She's a graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School and Columbia Law School's Master of Laws program. She has also spent several years working and managing and directing and supervising a indigenous non-governmental organization located just outside of the DC area. The first, the name precisely because it changed, First Peoples Worldwide. And so Christina brings a true comparative and international depth with her own background in Canadian law and as a First Nations woman. And so she will be kicking off the panel tonight, followed by my colleague, Vice Chairman Robert Valencia of the Pasquayaki tribe, a federally recognized tribe located in the south end of Tucson. Vice Chairman Valencia has spent really the better part of his life and his career in various positions of leadership within his tribe, including formerly being the chair of his tribe. He has extensive experience with economic development and many of the community issues that go along with economic development that we've talked about in previous classes, with an interesting and unique perspective for us on the panel this evening, given the cross-border aspect of the Yaqui communities and their challenges vis-a-vis Mexico and the United States. And so we'll hear a little bit about that as well. And again, all under the rubric of access to capital and the struggles and some of the challenges and successes that Indigenous communities have in this area. And then lastly, indeed, it's a great honor to have Chief Alan Claxton here with us this evening from the Sayo First Nation. And Chief Claxton has spent in excess of 20 years in First Nations leadership. And you'll recall in the last class, two classes previously, we spent a good deal of time talking about the history of Aboriginal title in Canada and the special legal history as it pertains to the south end of Vancouver Island and the Saanich First Nations and the experiences that they have gone through. So Chief Claxton stands out for many, many reasons, including some of the cutting-edge work that he's done in the area of land use and development and taxation. And you'll recall I'd mentioned this previously. His community is the only community south of the Northwest Territories that has a GST remission agreement with the federal government. So many of the issues that we talked about at the very beginning of the class, of the course, Chief Claxton's community has addressed head-on in a very unique and interesting way. So we're looking forward to hearing more about those challenges and those successes. So I think it's a great panel that we have this evening, and we will begin. So I'll just join you on the side here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Hopkins. Can everyone hear me? As Professor Hopkins mentioned, my name is Christina Bishop, and I work with the Inter-American Development Bank, which is an international organization based in Washington, D.C. It's very similar to the World Bank, but we're the largest financing for development, mostly social development, in Latin America. And the bank is owned by 46 countries, and we lend to 26. And so we lend to all the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. There's an extraordinarily large and diverse population of indigenous peoples in the region. And part of my job is to ensure that the bank's operations are not negatively impacting on those communities, and also that our programs are being adapted for cultural reasons, for social reasons, and for geographically imperative reasons to those communities. And so that's the job that I do, and also working with the bank on policy. We have in 2006, the bank had the board of the bank, which is the ministers of finance of the 46 countries that own the bank, approved a policy on indigenous peoples. And the policy has two sections, and one section obligates the bank to ensure that we are benefiting indigenous peoples to the greatest possible way of all bank operations, and the other part says that there is certain principles that the bank will adhere to in lending to countries, because the bank, our main bread and butter is sovereign guaranteed loans, which means governments guarantee loans from the bank for social development, for roads, for dams. There's actually quite a diverse number of sectors that the bank lends in. Every year we lend $13 billion, and we make between 1 and 12% on those loans. Right now, the bank cannot lend to indigenous communities. We can provide grants to indigenous entrepreneurs. We can try to make the loans that we make to government. But again, a lot of these are not revenue generating loans. These are for social development, health, education, building roads. A lot of these are government responsibilities, but they're not actually making money in a for-profit type way. So, but what we do try to do is try to make them sustainable and make sure that they don't impact the communities, and the communities can benefit in some ways. I can't say that we do a fantastic job. It's an extraordinarily complicated place to work in Latin America, and the legal frameworks are very difficult. And not all the countries have very strong frameworks on indigenous peoples. So one of the issues is, how do we make sure that the grants are acting similar to providing incentives and providing money for indigenous entrepreneurs to actually expand their businesses or become. One of the main areas that we are now starting to explore is the issue of climate change, and providing money to communities to provide environmental services so that they can actually be involved in climate change, which I don't know how many people are familiar with the whole climate change debate, but I find it extraordinarily complicated. But there's actually quite an opportunity there for indigenous communities who live in the areas where a lot of this activity is starting to take place, to be actually not just benefiting, but also actually providing some of the services that usually we spend a lot of money on consultants to come in and provide those services. So I've been, as Professor Hopkins mentioned, I've been working in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and I've done some work in Canada and the United States as well on community development. And I just thought that one of the things that I could share were maybe two observations that after doing this work on these different levels, I've worked with national governments, I've worked with communities, and there's two things that I think keep coming up. And the number one is a lot when we're talking about community development, we often it's very externally focused. It's, you know, I work for this large organization that we have a lot of requirements. We have a lot of policies. We have a lot of reasons that we can't do a lot of things, essentially. But it's all very generated by us. It's not generated by the communities. It's not identifying what they're interested in, what they need. It's very much oriented to what we feel that we can do or not do. And all of our work has to be negotiated with 46 countries. Norway, France, Japan, Venezuela, Argentina, Trinidad and Tobago. So it ends up being very, very complicated. And the issue of Indigenous peoples becomes even more complicated because there is such a difference between the national policies. And Canada is also on the board of directors and also has very interesting things to say about Indigenous development in Latin America. So one of the lessons that I've learned with this work is we don't focus enough on what the community assets are. And what does the community already have? And what does the community want to do? And what can the community contribute? A lot of international development financing, which is essentially what I do, is very much focused on what they don't have. They don't have good health care, they don't have good education, but there's not a lot of appreciation for what could be considered community education, what could be considered other assets of the community that could contribute. And so it's always externally focused, and you know, we're really not doing a very good job. The indicators have not changed in the last 20 years in Latin America. Education levels are not getting better. Health outcomes are not getting better. Maternal mortality is not getting better. And the gap between Indigenous peoples, who are often the poorest of the poor, and the rest of the society in Latin America is actually getting wider. So obviously what we're doing is not working. And so one of the things that I've been exploring a little bit is this idea of and I know we've tried to do it in North America too, this idea of access to capital as what could be alternative collateral as opposed to what is traditional collateral for banks. And I'm not sure how far that's getting either. Because I know in Latin America we've talked about the idea of community forests as collateral. Now under climate change they're talking about carbon credits being collateral. But it hasn't been very well developed. But I think the idea of looking at a community economy versus only national economies, and that's really how a lot of this is seen. It's how does this relate to the national economy as opposed to that it's an economy in and of itself. And there are elements there that have not been regarded with the same value. And there's a lot of external elements that are brought in, but I'm not seeing that it's really helping. The other lesson, what I'm starting to also appreciate is we have funding cycles. Funding cycles are not the same as a community development plan. They're always very arbitrary and they're one-year cycles because that's what we can actually focus on. And at the end of the year, there's often, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but then the funding cycle ends and that's kind of the end. And communities are expected to continue. There's a judgment about whether the project was successful or not. I mean, I worked on a project in southern Guyana, which was a fish farming project that ended kind of before the fish were even really born. And then I was asked to assess the success of the project. Well, it's a fish farm that has no fish. But then when we tried to argue that funding cycles for community development need to actually reflect not only seasonal cycles, cultural calendars, that we need to actually build into these funding cycles some flexibility for the community to actually be able to not only work among the community and develop a community support, ownership of the project, but also to allow a couple cycles for them to actually be considered successful or not, or adjusted, or changed in any way. I think that becomes very, and I guess it's just because I do work for an organization that is very strict. that I see all of these very clearly, because it's project after project after project of 12 to 18 months. And then at the end it's, well, that project wasn't successful. We knew working with Indigenous peoples was going to be difficult. And I'm not sure that we can say that after 18 months. You know, the national governments have 6 years to implement a health program. And I'm not sure those are very successful after 6 years either. So I guess kind of the two lessons that I'm starting to see in my work, which is very, like the grants that we provide to Indigenous communities have to be between 150 and 3 million. And they're for everything from small garden projects to health programs, looking at ways to adapt national health programs to make them more appropriate for Indigenous communities, to training programs, to leadership development. And you know, I think we need to just start thinking about how this all fits with a community economy. And I'm not sure that I'm being very clear about what I mean about a community economy, but it's how traditionally did the community develop? How did they make priorities? How did they trade, share, to meet basic needs? How was a community self-sufficient? And I really think that we can, if we focus on that, we can actually make it in a modern context also self-sufficient. And I'll just close with a little story of someone I worked with many years ago had started something. She didn't finish it, and I wish she had, and I think there's some work here for someone who has some time. But what she was looking at is reservation economies in the United States. They had, I think they were looking mostly in South Dakota. And what they looked at is the amount of money that came into a community and how long it took for that money to leave. And most of the time it was within 24 hours. And in pure economics philosophy and theory, that's not what should be happening. That money should be recycled several times within that community before it leaves. And the way you do that is you identify so then they looked at what are people spending that money on. And it was on basic things: tire repair, haircuts, foodstuffs. It was really the things that if you think about when you get your paycheck, what you go out and spend it on. And so then what they did is they did some small grants to some people to provide those essential services in the first, in the community. And so what the goal was to recycle the money 3 times. And what they did by providing those basic services in the communities, by having a couple hairdressers, having a couple people who repair tires, which I guess in South Dakota you need. People who repair tires is what I understand is a big community need. I think they had a couple small businesses. And what they did was they saw that money stayed in the community for a week, and it benefited something like 25 people. So it was very interesting. She didn't finish the whole study, but I think it would be very interesting to look at it that way of how do we support each other? How do we try to benefit as many people as possible with that dollar? Because, you know, it's that love-hate relationship. The community was supporting all of the border towns, but in a very one-way relationship. There wasn't a lot coming back to the community, but they were the main depositors of all the banks, but they didn't actually borrow any money from any of the banks. So I think there's some very interesting things that are starting and have started and are out there about what I think is really the answer, is bringing this all back to a community level and how the community functions, rather than constantly looking externally and having these big projects that are being brought in under the assumption. And I've actually sat across from people who tell me that the communities don't have anything. And that's why it's very much a charity model. And I don't think that's fair. And so that's kind of my thoughts on the topic.